Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Let's begin with Story 1. The Salt Cod Economy, Boredom, Fish, and Empire in the North Atlantic. In the still, gray mornings of 17th century Newfoundland, a quiet revolution was underway, though few today remember it, and fewer then understood it. Amid cold Atlantic winds, sun-scarred men bent over wooden racks, laying out slabs of codfish in tidy rows, salting them with a practiced, mechanical precision. These scenes repeated for decades, mostly unnoticed by the great chroniclers of history. But the salted cod economy would shape the rise and grind of empires. The story begins not with kings or battles, but with fish. Atlantic cod, Gadus morhua, was abundant along the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, a cold, nutrient-rich ecosystem ideal for cod spawning. Indigenous peoples had fished these waters for centuries. But after John Cabot's 1497 voyage, financed by the English crown, European fishermen descended en masse. By the early 1500s, Portuguese, Basque, Breton, and English fishing crews were engaged in what amounted to seasonal fish harvesting migrations. They came not to settle, but to work an early form of industrial labor that required endurance more than innovation. Crews would sail in spring, spend months fishing and drying the cod, and return by late summer to European markets. The monotony was ritualistic. Men in thick wool sweaters, soaked with sea brine, pulled line after line of cod, gutted them with expert swiftness, and stacked them for drying. Drying was vital. Wet fish rotted quickly. Salt preserved them. Drying racks made from pine and spruce allowed wind and sun to dehydrate the flesh. The process was painstaking, requiring constant rotation of the fillets. A poorly dried fish was a wasted voyage. Why was this fish so important? Cod, when salted and dried properly, could last years. In a world with no refrigeration, it was the protein of the working class, clergy, and military. Sailors ate it at sea. Monks ate it during Lenten fasts. Slaves in the Caribbean were often fed little else. Indeed, the cod trade grew not just because of European appetite, but because it fed the plantation economies of the West Indies. Salt cod was cheap, bland, and durable, perfect for fueling labor without pleasure. Yet this wasn't merely a tale of economic transaction. Cod shaped maritime routes and colonial outposts. France, eager to establish itself in the New World, founded settlements in Newfoundland and Acadia largely to support their fisheries. England's early interest in North America was less about gold and more about fish. Before Jamestown and Plymouth, there were English cod stations on the cold shores of Newfoundland. Over time, settlements grew, but they remained austere. Families of fishermen lived in shacks near the shore. They mended nets, maintained boats, and tended to the endless drying of fish. Their calendars revolved around tides and temperature, their lives as cyclical and unchanging as the cod they dried. There were no grand revolutions here, no lofty speeches, just salt, silence, and survival. The government's involvement was typically late and clumsy. In France, royal inspectors monitored the cod trade's customs duties but cared little for the labor conditions. In England, Parliament ignored the fishery until it became a source of imperial revenue. Smuggling was common. Entire cargoes would vanish into private hands. Cod was profit, and profit always found its way around the rules. Religion played a subtle role. Catholic countries, especially Spain and Portugal, maintained strict fasting regulations. On Fridays, meat was forbidden. Fish became a spiritual obligation. Cod wasn't sacred, but it was necessary. Thus, the papacy indirectly fueled cod's economic rise by enforcing religious dietary law. Without Lent and fasting days, would salt cod have become an imperial commodity? The laborers themselves were rarely documented. They came from coastal villages Cornwall, Brittany, Galicia, often poor, often desperate. For many, the fishery was better than starving at home. There are few surviving journals or letters. What remains are logs and manifests, names, weights, prices. History records their toil as numbers, not stories. Still, beneath the figures and dried fillets, something extraordinary took shape. Cod connected empires. It linked the ice-laden coasts of Newfoundland to Lisbon, Bordeaux, Bristol, and eventually to the Caribbean. It funded towns, supported navies, and became part of geopolitical strategy. Even Napoleon's blockade strategies acknowledged the importance of fisheries. And so the question emerges. In the endless rows of drying racks and the scraping of salt into cod flesh, were these workers part of an unseen revolution? Did they know that their repetitive labor was the vertebrae of global trade? As the 17th century progressed into the 18th, the cod trade expanded like a tide, slow, relentless, and deeply transformative. Newfoundland and the Grand Banks remained central, but the true scope of the cod economy spread far beyond cold Atlantic shores. If Section 1 revealed how the quiet toil of fishermen underpinned a protein empire, this section will uncover how that humble commodity linked vast regions, reshaped economies, and even altered the diets and social fabrics of entire continents. At the heart of this web was the triangular trade, though salt cod often hides in its shadow. While sugar, tobacco, and enslaved humans dominate most schoolbook summaries, salt cod was equally essential, particularly in feeding enslaved laborers on plantations. Caribbean plantations from Barbados to Saint Domingue, now Haiti, consumed enormous amounts of salt cod, cheap, filling, and easy to store. Caribbean planters didn't care for the delicacy or flavor of cod. They cared that it could be purchased by the ton, packed into barrels, and served 3 times a day to workers expected to harvest cane from dawn to dusk. In many cases, plantation owners bartered molasses or rum for cod from New England traders. This made cod not just a product of empire, it became a fuel for empire. The Boston Caribbean Cod Connection. New England's economy, especially Massachusetts and Rhode Island, came to revolve around fish. By the early 18th century, Boston merchants exported hundreds of thousands of pounds of dried cod annually. 2 varieties emerged. West India, cod lower quality, intended for plantation labor, and European market cod, which was salted and dried with meticulous care for Spanish, Portuguese, and Catholic buyers who valued religious fasting traditions. Boston's waterfront buzzed with cooperages for making barrels, chandlers supplying ships, and rope walks for making ropes used on vessels, all supported by the cod economy. Insurance firms, shipbuilding industries, and even some of the earliest American banks found their roots in fish wealth. In this sense, the colonial American economy had a scaly spine: cod. The trade patterns were precise. Ships would sail from New England, full of cod, flour, and livestock, to Caribbean ports. There they would offload cargo and receive molasses or sugar in return. This would then be brought back north or even shipped to Europe. Cod may have seemed unremarkable, but it moved within a highly structured, well-organized logistics system, one of the earliest examples of colonial global supply chains. Salt, the silent partner. While cod played the starring role, salt was the enabler. Cod could not be preserved without it, and salt was both abundant and scarce, abundant in specific geographies, like the Iberian Peninsula, the Bay of Biscay, and Caribbean salt ponds, but expensive or difficult to obtain in colder climates. Newfoundland, for instance, had excellent cod but poor access to salt. This created strange dependencies. New Englanders often bought salt from the Caribbean or southern Europe, hauled it to Newfoundland, and used it to process the fish they caught there. Salt thus formed an invisible second leg of the triangle. In places like Salt Key and the Turks and Caicos, massive salt ponds were built by enslaved people under brutal conditions. They harvested the sea's evaporation, collecting crusts of salt, drying it, and packing it for export. Salt, too, then, had a dark history built on exploitation, linked with empire, and utterly essential to the seemingly humble cod. In France, the gabelle, a salt tax levied by the monarchy, meant that salt was both politically charged and socially resented. French fishermen had to carefully account for salt purchases, and smugglers often moved untaxed salt from one province to another. Thus, even in the motherland, the salt behind the cod became a source of inequality, frustration, and regulation. Bureaucracy and fish. The cod trade also gave rise to one of the more boring yet critical phenomena of modern statehood: bureaucracy. Merchants had to file bills of lading, customs declarations, and shipping logs. Port inspectors checked weights and quality. Insurance companies required valuations. Colonial governments levied duties, then used these revenues to build roads, maintain harbors, and, increasingly, fund military expeditions. In London, the Board of Trade maintained copious files on colonial fish production. French port officials in La Rochelle and Bayonne submitted annual reports on fish landings. Lisbon's government tracked imports of bacalhau, salt cod, from Newfoundland and New England, an essential part of Portuguese dietary culture. Though few citizens realized it, their dinner often passed through bureaucratic labyrinths before reaching the plate. Some governments even regulated how the cod should be cut. The split and dry method produced stockfish, unsalted, air-dried, while others required wet salting before drying. The type of preservation dictated market value and final destination. These distinctions were policed, taxed, and disputed regularly in court. It is not too much to say that some early elements of colonial administrative capacity were forged not in silver mines or battlefields, but in the ledger books of fish merchants. Towns built on cod. Several towns across the Atlantic world owe their rise to cod. St. John, in Newfoundland, grew from a seasonal station to a year-round settlement due to the fishery's persistent economic promise. Similarly, Gloucester, Massachusetts, transformed into one of North America's oldest fishing ports. Even today, statues of fishermen stand facing the sea there, though few tourists think about cod's broader historical significance. In Europe, towns like Bilbao, Porto, and Nantes thrived in part because of their roles as distribution hubs. Portuguese merchants sold cod across the Iberian Peninsula. In Norway, Bergen exported massive quantities of stockfish to the Baltic. All these towns, so different in culture, were bound by their shared reliance on a bland white fish. Cod in class. Interestingly, cod became a dietary marker of class. In England, by the 18th century, cod was largely working-class fare. It was cheap, unseasoned, and usually boiled or fried. In Catholic Europe, however, cod held religious significance, especially during Lent. Even the nobility were expected to abstain from meat on fasting days, and thus cod appeared in fine kitchens cooked with olive oil, almonds, or wine sauces. In Portugal and Spain, cod became a staple even outside fasting periods. Bacalhau still holds a sacred place in Portuguese cuisine today. But during the early modern period, the rich and poor consumed the same fish, albeit prepared differently. This convergence of class and diet is rare in history and almost always driven by necessity rather than taste. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, cod had another function entirely. It symbolized oppression. Plantation slaves often received salted cod and no other protein. There was no butter, no oil, and usually no cooking freedom. Boiled and eaten plain, it became an emblem of coercion, a substance of survival rather than sustenance. Conflict, cod, and naval superiority. Control over cod fisheries also played a role in imperial conflict. The Anglo-French rivalry often featured battles over fishery rights in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, included provisions about fishing zones, and French access to the French shore in Newfoundland became a point of recurring tension. By the mid-18th century, the cod fishery wasn't just an economic concern, it was a strategic resource. A strong fishing fleet trained sailors who could later serve in navies. Cod provided income to support wartime economies and helped maintain morale during long naval voyages. In short, salted fish was a building block of sea power. New England's fish merchants also played subtle roles in the lead-up to the American Revolution. British attempts to restrict trade with non-British colonies frustrated Boston merchants who depended on Caribbean buyers. The non-importation agreements that boycotted British goods had parallels in the cod trade. Fish merchants found alternative markets, sometimes illicitly, highlighting a growing sense of economic independence. And so, beneath the surface of dried, salted fish, one finds the roots of rebellion and the threads of maritime dominance. The fish was silent, but the empires were not. But one must ask, if the empire was powered by fish, what happened when the fish began to dwindle? By the late 18th and into the 19th century, the cod trade that had quietly undergirded vast swathes of global imperial commerce began to show signs of strain. Not from revolt or scandal, but from something slower and far more insidious: ecological exhaustion, economic restructuring, and the shifting momentum of global industry. This was not an abrupt collapse. Like the fish itself, the decline of the cod economy was silent, layered, and preserved in official reports, journals, and commercial statistics. Cod remained a staple, particularly in Catholic Europe, but by the dawn of the 19th century, the forces that once made it the lifeblood of empire began to turn against it. Overfishing and the quiet collapse. Centuries of exploitation, without significant understanding of marine ecology, led to the slow decline of cod stocks. The fishing methods, initially based on hand lines and long lines, were sustainable enough in small numbers. But as demand grew, vessels became larger, voyages longer, and techniques more aggressive. In the early 1800s, some fishing stations in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia began recording smaller fish, fewer catches, and longer trips to reach the same yields. The Grand Banks, once teeming with life, started to show signs of fatigue. Though no one used the word overfishing at the time, the cause was clear to those who depended on the sea. Still, the reaction was not conservation but expansion. Fishermen pushed further afield. Some moved north to Labrador or south toward the Carolinas and the Caribbean. This expansion temporarily offset the problem, but at the cost of longer, more expensive voyages. What had once been a seasonal business now required greater capital, larger crews, and more bureaucratic coordination. In many ways, this shift mirrored broader economic trends. The cod economy, like much of early industry, was evolving from a localized craft into a proto-industrial sector, larger, less flexible, and increasingly vulnerable to disruption. Industrialization and the changing nature of work. As the 19th century advanced, the Industrial Revolution reshaped the economies of Europe and North America. Urban centers grew. Machines transformed textile production, metalworking, and even food processing. In this context, the cod fishery began to feel outdated, still seasonal, still dependent on the weather, and still fundamentally artisanal. Yet it was during this period that the first cod canneries appeared. Canned fish, preserved using the newer technique of steam sterilization, allowed cod to compete with newer, fresher protein sources. But the taste was different, the price higher, and the trust lower. Dried cod continued to dominate markets in southern Europe and the Caribbean, even as canneries began to redefine how fish might reach tables inland. Labor, too, was shifting. Younger workers increasingly sought urban employment over the cold, wet, and often perilous work of fishing. Fishermen's cooperatives emerged in New England and the Canadian Maritimes to maintain economic power, but the trade was losing its generational continuity. For the first time in centuries, fishing was no longer an assumed way of life for coastal communities. Some maritime families turned to whaling, others to shipbuilding or merchant trade. Still others found themselves in a slow spiral of economic decline, tied to a resource base that no longer provided the returns of the past. The cod economy wasn't collapsing in dramatic fashion, but it was drifting into irrelevance, a shadow of its former centrality. Cod and colonies after revolution. The cod trade had long benefited from imperial protection and colonial demand. But by the early 19th century, revolutions and independence movements reshaped that equation. The American Revolution, 1775–1783, temporarily disrupted trade between New England and the Caribbean, as British naval blockades and shifting alliances made it difficult to operate. The Haitian Revolution, 1791–1804, not only destroyed one of the most important sugar colonies, but also disrupted the cod market that had fed it. The Latin American independence movements of the early 19th century opened new markets, but also destabilized traditional ones. After the American colonies gained independence, British merchants increasingly favored Canadian fisheries. This diverted investment from New England ports and slowly shifted the cod trade's center of gravity northward. Halifax and St. John's grew while Boston adapted, diversified, and eventually leaned more on manufacturing than maritime exports. The British Empire, now focused on maintaining trade with the Caribbean and developing Australian and Indian markets, kept cod in its diet but no longer considered it a strategic priority. Salted cod was becoming an everyday commodity, not an engine of expansion. The Portuguese and Spanish empires, facing their own imperial declines and Napoleonic invasions, scaled back their once formidable fleets. In Lisbon and Cadiz, cod still appeared on plates, but the institutions behind it were shrinking. In this way, cod became both ordinary and foundational, still present, still sustaining, but no longer commanding attention. Paper trails and memory. One of the most fascinating aspects of the salt cod economy is its paper legacy. Hundreds of thousands of documents, port ledgers, customs reports, insurance forms, merchant letters testify to the scale and intricacy of this trade. But these documents rarely appear in mainstream histories. Cod lacks the glamour of conquest, the passion of revolution, or the vivid personalities of court intrigue. And yet, these ledgers tell us how families survived, how towns were built, and how the mundane can underwrite the magnificent. In Nova Scotia's provincial archives, one can find long-forgotten files on shipments of cod to Havana. In Seville, invoices describe cod packed in corkwood barrels bound for monasteries in Galicia. In Boston, records show traders petitioning local authorities for tax relief after cargo losses in Caribbean storms. Each line, simple, dry, and devoid of embellishment, adds to the deeper understanding of how boring economics shaped complex empires. Cod today, from staple to symbol. The cod economy persisted well into the 20th century, and for some regions, particularly Newfoundland, it remained central until the 1990s. But decades of industrial trawling finally led to an ecological crisis. In 1992, the Canadian government imposed a moratorium on northern cod fishing after stocks collapsed from overfishing. Entire communities were devastated. Generations of fishers found themselves without purpose or income. It was the final echo of an old economic world finally breaking apart. Today, cod is still eaten. It still holds cultural significance, especially in Portugal, Spain, and Brazil. But it no longer powers trade or underpins colonies. It no longer funds navies or drives tax reform. It is, at last, a food rather than a force. Yet its legacy lingers in ways unseen. Salt cod helped shape Atlantic identities. It made Protestant England and Catholic Portugal unlikely economic partners. It fed revolutions. It built towns and bore witness to exploitation. And through it all, it remained unchanged, white, flaky, unremarkable in flavor, but utterly indispensable. So when we consider revolutions and empires, the rise of modern states, or the logistics of colonial trade, we might pause to remember that behind many great moments in history, there were barrels of salted fish, quietly doing their part. And one final question lingers like the scent of brine in a coastal breeze. If history is made in grand halls and on battlefields, why did it so often depend on men gutting fish in silence? Story 2. Margaret Cavendish, the philosopher nobody listened to. The corridors of early modern science and philosophy echo with names like Descartes, Hobbes, and Boyle, men whose ideas would shape centuries. Yet among these familiar figures, one voice whispered rather than roared. Her name was Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle upon Tyne. She lived in an age when women were excluded from universities, salons, and academies. And yet she wrote relentlessly. About atoms, about souls, about nature, about women. She published under her own name at a time when most women could not legally hold property or attend school. Her writings were verbose, meandering, and often contradictory. She criticized experimental science but also sought entry to the Royal Society. She argued for women's education but opposed some feminist ideas. She admired rationalism and yet believed deeply in poetic imagination. And while her work was widely ridiculed, dismissed as the babblings of a curious duchess, Cavendish represents something profound, the boring perseverance of a brilliant mind, uninvited but undeterred. Born Margaret Lucas in 1623, the youngest of 8 children in a wealthy royalist family, she grew up in Colchester, Essex, during a time of civil strife. Her early years coincided with the build-up to the English Civil War. Her brothers fought for the king. Her family's fortune suffered. But young Margaret spent much of her time in relative isolation, entertaining herself with books and observation, writing poetry, and developing a peculiar sense of her place in the world. She was curious, intensely so, and often described herself as melancholic, shy, and given to musing. In a world where a woman's education was often limited to needlework and scripture, Margaret cultivated a private universe of thought. She wrote that her mind was like a great vast building, unfurnished. There's a sadness there, but also a quiet ambition. She wanted to furnish it herself. In 1644, as royalist forces crumbled, Margaret joined the exiled royal court of Queen Henrietta Maria in France, where she became a maid of honor. There, she met William Cavendish, Marquess and later Duke of Newcastle, a widower 30 years her senior, and a man who appreciated intellect in unconventional packages. They married in 1645. William was not a typical noble. He wrote plays, poems, and political treatises. The couple, both in exile and out of favor, became intellectual partners. They were not equals. No marriage in 17th century England was, but William encouraged Margaret's writing and even paid to have her work published, something nearly unheard of for a woman at the time. The couple returned to England in the 1650s, impoverished and politically irrelevant, but Margaret was undeterred. She began to write and write prolifically. In the span of 2 decades, she produced over a dozen books, including treatises on philosophy, science, poetry, fiction, and plays. Some of these were meandering and unclear, others bold and visionary. She tackled natural philosophy, which today we would call science. At a time when thinkers like Robert Boyle were pioneering experimental methods, Cavendish was skeptical. In her 1666 work Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, she criticized the Royal Society for using microscopes and other instruments, claiming that artificial tools distorted nature rather than clarified it. She wrote, "Art may make things appear what they are not, and obscure them from being truly known." To many readers today, this sounds Luddite or regressive, but Cavendish was engaging in a deeper debate. Could human observation ever truly reflect nature? Were tools extensions of the mind or distortions? It was not a question she resolved few of hers were, but one she pressed upon the reader with insistence. In that same year, she also published The Blazing World, a strange and fantastical piece of fiction that is now considered one of the earliest examples of science fiction. In it, a woman travels to another world via the North Pole and becomes empress of a society where talking animals debate science and philosophy. The work is allegorical, surreal, and deeply personal. But more than its content, the significance lies in its ambition. Here was a woman writing herself into philosophical authority, imagining a world where she, not men, set the laws of reason. Still, the broader world mocked her. Male scholars called her Mad Madge. Critics dismissed her as vain, eccentric, and self-obsessed. She was the only woman to visit a meeting of the Royal Society during its founding decades. She watched a demonstration by hook and boyle, and her presence caused more gossip than praise. She was not welcomed, she was observed. Her appearance, too, was unusual. She wore extravagant gowns favoring black and silver. Her speech was considered odd. Her books often included prefaces defending herself, anticipating ridicule. She knew the world found her strange. She embraced it awkwardly, boldly. And through it all, she wrote. Without institutional support, without academic networks, and often without intellectual allies. Her sentences were long. Her arguments circled themselves. Her thoughts contradicted, diverged, returned. She seemed to care less about consistent systems and more about wrestling with ideas in motion. She believed that the world was composed not of lifeless particles, as Descartes or Boyle might argue, but of rational matter, a kind of living fabric with its own intelligence. She wrote of matter in motion, presaging, in poetic terms, ideas that would later resemble theories in thermodynamics and chaos. But her ideas were mostly ignored in her time, and yet she kept publishing, even when few read her work. Why? Perhaps it was because, in an era of men defining reason, Margaret Cavendish simply could not accept that she was not allowed to think aloud. Perhaps the question is not why she was dismissed, but how she endured. She once wrote, "I had rather appear worse in singularity than better in the mode." Her singularity was not flamboyant, it was boring in the most courageous way. She insisted, again and again, on her right to exist in thought, in print, and in contradiction. And so we are left wondering. In a world built to silence her, why did she never stop speaking? As Margaret Cavendish matured in both age and intellect, her writing grew bolder and stranger. While her critics derided her as eccentric, unqualified, or simply unreadable, she pressed onward, issuing volumes that refused to fit cleanly into any intellectual box. In a world just beginning to map the borders between science, literature, and philosophy, Cavendish stood defiantly at the center, refusing to be categorized, classified, or silenced. This section will follow the middle period of Cavendish's intellectual life from her return to England in the 1650s through the publication of her more experimental works. Here, we find the Duchess at her most prolific, most contradictory, and most isolated. The mind in motion, her natural philosophy. At the core of Cavendish's philosophy was an obsession with motion and matter. Unlike the dualists of her time, Descartes especially, who saw the world as composed of matter and mind, or body and soul, Cavendish rejected such binary distinctions. In her view, all things were composed of matter that moved, but this wasn't the lifeless, inert matter of classical mechanics. Cavendish imagined a world full of self-aware, rational, sensitive particles, a cosmos made not of dead atoms bouncing in voids, but of living, thinking bits of substance. She called her theory vitalist materialism, although she didn't use that term herself. In modern language, it's a kind of panpsychism. Everything has some degree of thought or awareness, from stones to stars. To her, The material world was not a clockwork of dumb parts but a vibrant, interconnected whole, where even dust motes held the spark of reason. Her 1663 book, Philosophical and Physical Opinions, outlines this theory in a sprawling, discursive fashion. She writes, "The world is a self-moving body. All parts have life and knowledge." This placed her at odds with the rising experimentalist men like Boyle, Hooke, and Newton, who saw nature as something to be measured, dissected, and mathematically described. Cavendish, by contrast, emphasized intuition, sensation, and internal harmony. To her, microscopes and instruments only distorted what nature presented openly. Observation was less important than reflection. It wasn't that she opposed inquiry, she simply believed that nature revealed itself best through reason, not tools. This made her unpopular with experimental philosophers and mechanists, who were eager to separate the mystical from the measurable. But Cavendish did not retreat. She questioned not only the findings of these men but the philosophical basis of their methods. Her critiques, while often rambling, touched on concepts that would resurface centuries later: ideas about the observer effect, bias in instrumentation, and the limits of empirical certainty. And yet, she rarely offered a clean alternative. Her own philosophy, built on metaphors, analogies, and endless elaboration, was more poetic than precise. This frustrated those who sought rigor, but her purpose was different. She wasn't trying to build a model of nature. She was trying to show that women, too, could question nature's workings and be taken seriously. Self-publishing and self-defense. Cavendish's ideas might never have reached a wide audience were it not for her wealth and privilege. She had no university platform, no scholarly appointments, and few allies in the intellectual world. But she had the means to self-publish, and she used it to flood the literary market with her books. These books were often prefaced by long letters to the reader, in which Cavendish pleaded, scolded, justified, or speculated about how she might be received. Her tone varied, sometimes confident, other times insecure. She admitted she was not a scholar, had no tutors, and lacked formal training. But she also insisted on her right to publish, to think aloud, and to experiment with ideas. This combination, defensiveness mixed with defiant self-assertion, became her hallmark. She wrote in the World's Olio, "Though I cannot be Henry V or Charles II, yet I endeavor to be Margaret I." The line is telling. She didn't want to be king. She wanted to be first in her own realm, however small, a queen of thought, a duchess of discourse, an intellectual monarch in exile. Still, the academic world mocked her. The Royal Society refused her membership, as it did for all women. Her critiques of experimental science were brushed off. Her plays were rarely performed. And yet, her name persisted. The sheer volume of her output made her impossible to ignore. The visit to the Royal Society. Perhaps the most famous event in Cavendish's life aside from her writings was her visit to the Royal Society in 1667. This was not a lecture, nor a ceremony. She simply requested to observe a demonstration, and astonishingly, the society allowed it. She arrived dressed elaborately, trailing fabric and curiosity. Men whispered, some laughed. She was the first woman to visit, and she came not as a wife or ornament but as a thinker. During the demonstration, she watched Boyle experiment with air pumps and vacuums. She asked questions, took notes, and left. The visit caused a stir. Satirical poems were written. Gossip columns snickered. Scholars dismissed her as eccentric, but she had made her point. She had entered the room, asked questions, and been seen an act of intellectual trespass that few women could imagine at the time. She later wrote about the Royal Society's tools and methods, expressing skepticism, not hostility but doubt. She didn't trust that instruments could tell the truth. She worried about manipulation, illusion, and the false sense of certainty that microscopes created. It wasn't long after that she published Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, where her critiques of mechanistic science were laid out fully. The Blazing World, fantasy, authority, and allegory. That same year, 1666, Cavendish also published her most famous and strangest work, The Description of a New Blazing World. Often considered the first work of science fiction written by a woman, it defies genre. The story follows a woman who enters another world through the North Pole and becomes empress of a land filled with bear men, birdmen, and other hybrid creatures. The empress rules with benevolence and intellect. She organizes scientific debates, reviews philosophical doctrines, and even wages wars of reason. Many scholars read the blazing world as a kind of philosophical utopia, a mirror to Cavendish's own mind, where she, unencumbered by gender or ridicule, might command an empire of thought. What is striking is that Cavendish made herself the central figure. The Empress is clearly a version of Margaret, curious, commanding, independent. In a world that refused to take her seriously, she invented a world where everyone did. But the book also questions itself. In the final section, the Empress travels back to Earth and meets her own Duchess, Cavendish's avatar, who becomes her scribe and spiritual advisor. The two women discuss matter, motion, love, and longing. It is a surreal self-dialogue between identity and ideal. What emerges from this literary kaleidoscope is not a coherent argument but a vision of female intellectual authority. Not in rebellion, but in construction. Not in opposition to men, but in creation of a space where imagination and inquiry can coexist. And yet, despite this bold act of literary defiance, Cavendish knew she would not be taken seriously. She ends the work not with triumph, but with quiet resignation. I do not find but that all I have done is nothing, for I see men can do all things. It is not a surrender, but it is a sigh. The paradox of Margaret Cavendish. Cavendish was not a modern feminist, nor a systematic thinker. She contradicted herself often. She supported monarchy but imagined utopias. She believed women should be educated but feared female rebellion. She embraced reason but adored poetic speculation. Some modern readers find this frustrating, others see it as liberating. Cavendish did not seek perfection. She sought permission to think, even imperfectly. Her ideas never sparked revolutions, rewrote paradigms, or founded schools. But they did something quieter, perhaps more radical. They made it possible for a woman in the 17th century to exist on the page as an intellectual being, stubborn, strange, and utterly her own. She was dismissed by her peers, forgotten for centuries. But today, scholars revisit her work not because it is easy or polished, but because it is honest in its ambition. And so we must ask, if she had been born a man, would Margaret Cavendish now be counted among the fathers of modern science? By the end of her life, Margaret Cavendish had published more books than many of her male peers. Her name, though controversial, was known throughout England's intellectual circles, if not for agreement, then for puzzled curiosity. She was, after all, the only woman whose voice appeared in the same breath as Hobbes, Boyle, and Descartes, even if it was often in mockery or dismissal. But Margaret did not live to see her ideas vindicated, nor did she leave behind a clear school of followers. When she died in 1673, at the age of 50, she left behind no children, no disciples, and a reputation that hovered uneasily between eccentric celebrity and philosophical outlier. This final section explores what happened to her legacy, and what her stubborn intellectual presence reveals about the boring yet powerful endurance of neglected thought. Death, obscurity, and a tomb of marble. Cavendish was buried at Westminster Abbey, in the same sacred ground that would later include names like Newton, Darwin, and Tennyson. This in itself was exceptional. Almost no women, and certainly no women of letters, received such honors in 17th century England. Her tomb is marked by an imposing statue of her husband, William Cavendish, kneeling in grief beside her. The inscription does not mention her books or her philosophical inquiries. It speaks of virtue, modesty, and wifely devotion. Silent, again, about the words she poured across thousands of pages. That silence, telling in its own way, would deepen over time. Intellectual eclipse. After her death, Margaret Cavendish's name slipped quietly from the mainstream of European thought. The Enlightenment was gathering speed. Thinkers like Locke, Leibniz, Newton, and Voltaire came to define the intellectual climate. Clarity, system building, and empirical rationalism were the new currency of credibility. Cavendish's sprawling, poetic, contradictory works did not fit the mold. She was too literary for philosophers, too philosophical for poets, too critical for scientists, and too speculative for theologians. Worse still, she was a woman who insisted on being read, even when it meant being ridiculed. In an era when the history of thought was being formalized, catalogued, footnoted, and institutionalized, Margaret Cavendish's work sat outside the canon. Some remembered her as a curiosity, others forgot her entirely. It would not be until the 20th century, with the rise of feminist literary criticism, that Cavendish's work began to be rediscovered in earnest. Rediscovery in a new century. In the 1970s and 80s, scholars interested in early modern women writers began sifting through forgotten texts. Margaret Cavendish's work, stored in libraries but rarely cited, emerged as a startling anomaly. A woman who published under her own name, wrote philosophical treatises, and imagined political utopias, all while defying the structures meant to exclude her. Today, Cavendish is studied in departments of literature, philosophy, history of science, and women's studies. Her theories of matter in motion are revisited as proto-ideas of emergent systems, her critique of observation as an early meditation on epistemological limits, and her science fiction as foundational. But modern appreciation still wrestles with her contradictions. She was a monarchist, yet utopian, a rationalist, yet mystical, a woman who criticized the patriarchy, yet celebrated domestic roles. She cannot be simplified into slogans. This may explain why she remains underread outside of specialist circles. Cavendish demands patience. Her sentences are long. Her arguments circle. She contradicts herself not out of carelessness, but because she understood that thinking is rarely clean and knowledge is rarely stable. Endurance through boredom. What sets Cavendish apart, and what makes her story particularly apt for the lens of boring history, is not drama or tragedy, it is persistence. There were no great uprisings around her work. No disciples carried her flame through revolution. Her impact was not explosive but glacial. Like a slow-moving tectonic plate, her ideas sat beneath the surface, shaping the intellectual terrain without notice. For a woman of her time, even the act of writing publicly was a resistance. She was told not to publish. She did. She was told she would be mocked. She was. She published again. She was told philosophy was no place for women. She filled bookshelves with philosophy. And though the world mostly shrugged, she did not stop. This kind of endurance, the quiet, lonely, relentless pursuit of thought in the face of apathy, is a form of intellectual labor that rarely receives praise. It is not dramatic. It is not victorious. But it is necessary. Without it, whole continents of possibility would never be mapped. Cavendish and the contemporary mind. In recent decades, Margaret Cavendish has become a symbol, albeit a complex one, for scholars seeking to understand what it means to be intellectually excluded. Her work raises enduring questions. Who decides what counts as knowledge? What voices are silenced by the systems of credibility? Can contradiction be a kind of insight? These are not questions Cavendish answered. They are questions she embodied. She did not have the institutional backing of Newton, nor the philosophical rigor of Leibniz. But she had something else, a refusal to disappear. Every book she wrote was an assertion not just of ideas, but of presence. And in that presence, she offered a kind of philosophical ghosting, haunting the margins of early modern thought with the reminder that someone else was also thinking. someone who was told not to, someone who did it anyway. Final reflection. Margaret Cavendish never claimed to be correct. She knew her work was imperfect, but she believed deeply that the act of thinking in public, of putting flawed ideas into the world, was itself a noble pursuit. In the end, her legacy is not one of resolution, but of provocation. She leaves us with a quiet, unanswered challenge. In a world built to ignore you, what does it mean to think anyway? Story 3. The Tax Farmers of Ancient Régime, France. Long before the guillotine became the grim symbol of the French Revolution, before Marie Antoinette's supposed cake and Robespierre's reign of terror, there was a quieter, slower revolution underway, one conducted not in the streets, but in ledgers. In the drawing rooms of Versailles and the smoky accounting offices of Paris, a peculiar group of men wielded immense power. They were not nobles, not clergy, and rarely politicians. They were tax farmers, members of a bureaucratic class known as the fermiers généraux, or general farmers. Their name suggests agriculture, but they grew wealth, not wheat. In a kingdom famed for its glittering court and starving peasants, these men ran the invisible machinery of finance, extracting, calculating, and profiting, all without lifting a sword or wearing a crown. Tax farming was one of the most quietly consequential institutions of the ancient regime. It shaped the economy, inflamed the populace, and contributed to the eventual collapse of royal authority. Yet it is rarely studied outside specialist circles. It is, in essence, boring history, numbers, contracts, and receipts, but in those numbers lay the seeds of revolution. What is tax farming? To understand the tax farmers, we must first understand the system they operated within. Under the ancient regime, the French monarchy was chronically short of cash. Wars, court expenditures, and administrative expansion all required revenue, but France lacked a modern bureaucratic tax collection infrastructure. Rather than collect taxes directly, the state outsourced the job, auctioning off the right to collect taxes to private individuals or companies in exchange for a fixed upfront payment. This system, known as fermage, was centuries old. A fermier général would pay the crown a lump sum, say, 20 million livres, for the right to collect certain taxes for a set number of years. Whatever he collected above that amount, he kept as profit. This might seem simple, but it was an extraordinarily profitable business. The taxes collected were not income taxes. France had none, but rather indirect taxes on salt, the gabelle, tobacco, customs duties, and tolls. These were regressive taxes hitting the poor hardest, and often enforced with brutal efficiency. In theory, tax farmers bore risk. If collections fell short, they lost money. But in practice, they used their private army of agents, clerks, inspectors, and bailiffs to maximize extraction. They wielded police powers, controlled access to markets, and even imprisoned those who resisted. The result was predictable. Tax farmers grew rich, while the state remained broke and the people grew resentful. The bureaucracy behind the veil. The ferme générale, the general tax farm, was not a group of individual rogue collectors. By the 18th century, it was a formalized corporation, a powerful institution composed of about 60 wealthy financiers, each a shareholder in the operation. These men, mostly from elite bourgeois families, were technocrats of a particular kind. They oversaw vast bureaucracies, complete with audit offices, legal departments, and logistics divisions. Their reach extended to nearly every corner of France. They kept detailed records, sometimes obsessively so. Volumes of receipts, registries of salt barrels, logs of tolls collected at river crossings. These records were precise because profit depended on detail. Each tax region or bureau had its own hierarchy: inspectors, sub-inspectors, weighers, scribes, and guards. The lowest ranks did the dirty work, measuring grain, seizing contraband salt, arresting violators of the tobacco monopoly. Many were poorly paid and prone to corruption, but the system was designed to benefit the top, not the bottom. From the outside, the fermiers Gainirocs lived in comfort. Their homes in Paris were opulent, their wardrobes impeccable. They sponsored art, commissioned portraits, and dined with nobles. They were not aristocrats by blood, but they often bought titles or married into old families. One particularly famous tax farmer, Claude Dupin, was the father-in-law of Madame de Pompadour, mistress to Louis XVI. Another, Alexander Lenoir, amassed one of the largest private fortunes in pre-revolutionary France. But their power came from their connection to the monarchy. The crown depended on them to provide cash up front. In return, they received protection, monopoly rights, and occasionally ennoblement. It was a symbiotic relationship until it was. The salt tax and its discontents. Among the most hated taxes was the gabelle, a levy on salt. Not only was salt essential for preserving food, but under French law, every adult was required to purchase a set amount annually, regardless of need. Worse still, the price of salt varied dramatically by region. In some areas, it was 5 times more expensive than others. This led to widespread smuggling, known as faux sonnage. Smugglers or faux sonniers often became folk heroes. Entire villages participated in illegal salt trade. Tax farmers were relentless in enforcing the salt tax. They had the legal right to search homes without warning, to arrest smugglers, and to confiscate property. In some regions, particularly in Brittany and Languedoc, salt riots erupted in response. Ordinary citizens came to see the tax farmers as predatory overlords, enriching themselves off the necessities of the poor. But resistance was usually small-scale, local, and violently repressed. It is telling that when revolution finally came in 1789, one of the earliest demands in the Cahiers de Doléances, grievance lists, was the abolition of tax farming. And when the Bastille fell, tax records were among the first targets of destruction. But this was still decades away. In the mid-18th century, the system thrived, profitable, insulated, and quietly rotting the state from within. A kingdom drowning in ledgers. While we often imagine monarchies as being run by kings and councils, the truth of ancient regime France was far duller. It was run by contracts, leases, and profit-sharing agreements. The crown, desperate for revenue but reluctant to impose taxes on nobles, leaned harder and harder on tax farmers to fill the gap. This produced strange results. During peacetime, the crown took loans from tax farmers. During wartime, it sold new tax leases to fund armies. To balance the budget, it granted more monopoly rights to existing farms, especially tobacco and salt. By the 1770s, nearly a third of royal revenue came from tax farms. But the underlying injustice of the system, its regressive nature, its favoritism, its exemptions, was becoming harder to hide. Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Voltaire and Turgot, began to question the morality of this structure. Still, the monarchy resisted reform. Louis XVI, though privately critical of tax farmers, depended on their money. Louis XVI, more sympathetic to reform, found himself trapped between financial necessity and popular outrage. As the American Revolution drained French coffers and bad harvests crippled food supply, the system began to creak under its own weight. And so we are left with a quiet paradox. How did a kingdom fall? Not through rebellion or invasion, but through ledgers and loopholes. By the mid-18th century, the firm Gainierail was both omnipresent and invisible, a sprawling apparatus of financial control that influenced nearly every corner of life in France, yet often operated out of public view. Its influence stretched from the salt pans of Brittany to the customs posts on the Rhine, from the cellars of Parisian taverns to the ports of Marseille. In this section, we descend deeper into the internal workings of the tax farming system. The quiet monotony of paperwork, bribes, seizures, and secrets formed a slow-motion collapse that would eventually become impossible to ignore. It was not a system built to fail, but one built to enrich itself, no matter what failed around it. The tobacco monopoly, rolling paper into gold. Perhaps the most profitable of all the tax farms was the tobacco monopoly. Introduced in the late 17th century and expanded in the 18th, tobacco became a major source of royal income, but only because it was handed over to the tax farmers to manage. Only the firm Gainerail could import, manufacture, and sell tobacco products. Private sellers were outlawed. Tobacco shops were regulated down to the gram. Prices were set by the farm. Quality was standardized. Packaging was controlled. To enforce this monopoly, the tax farmers developed an entire sub-police force, empowered to inspect warehouses and private homes suspected of harboring untaxed tobacco, arrest smugglers and impose fines, confiscate illicit rolling paper, pipes, and raw leaf. The enforcement was not merely economic. It created a culture of surveillance. Tavern owners feared being caught with unregulated stock. Travelers were searched. Porters and sailors were routinely questioned. The smell of tobacco could attract suspicion. Despite this, smuggling flourished. The margins were simply too good. Smugglers operated across borders, bringing in untaxed tobacco from Geneva, the Netherlands, and Spain. Some routes were well organized, complete with bribed officials, secret docks, and false compartments in carriages. Even priests were caught participating. The tax farmers responded by intensifying enforcement, raising penalties, and increasing the number of inspections. The result was a growing sense among the population that the monarchy, through its private collectors, was not just taxing them but spying on them. This would become a recurring theme. A state seen as distant and punitive, concerned more with revenues than justice. Lavish living and public resentment. While peasants risked imprisonment for a handful of salt or a packet of tobacco, the fermiers Gainerox themselves were living in lavish opulence. Their Paris residences, especially along the fashionable Boulevard Poissonnière and Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, were architectural statements of wealth. Marble staircases, gold leaf mirrors, imported silk curtains, and Flemish tapestries adorned their halls. Many commissioned private portraits by the best painters of the day. Among them was Claude Henry Waitlet, a tax farmer who became a patron of the arts. He sponsored operas, collected rare books, and entertained philosophers. Another, Joseph Paris Duvernay, founded banks and lent money to the crown directly, becoming one of the most powerful non-noble men in France. Some even bought noble titles or married their children into aristocratic families. A handful became counts, barons, or marquises, not by heritage but by liquid capital. They hosted salons. They funded Enlightenment writers. They supported the arts. But they did so in full view of a society where food prices were rising and wages stagnant. Satirical pamphlets from the time attacked them viciously. One common trope compared tax farmers to vampires, sucking the lifeblood from honest workers. Others mocked their newly purchased coats of arms, contrasting them with their merchant roots. What was most damning wasn't their wealth, but its source, not industry, invention, or battle, but the rents and seizures imposed on others. Court intrigue and ministerial complicity. The relationship between tax farmers and the royal government was not merely transactional. It was deeply political. The king and his ministers depended on the firm Gainerail for advance payments, especially in times of war or court expenditure. In return, the tax farmers expected political favors, renewal of contracts, legal immunity, suppression of investigations. Finance ministers were often caught between the public demand for reform and the need for fast money. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister, had tried to rein in tax farmers by proposing a state-run collection system, but his reforms were quietly diluted after his death. Later ministers, including Terray and Necker, attempted new regulations transparency measures, fairer auditing, even some partial nationalization. But these efforts failed under pressure from entrenched interests. By the 1770s, it was understood that any serious move against the firm Gainerail would result in a financial crisis or worse, the collapse of credit. This led to a strange stalemate. Everyone knew the system was corrupt. Everyone agreed it was inefficient. And yet, it remained in place because no one dared risk the consequences of dismantling it. A gilded cage, locked from within. Paper mountains and the weight of detail. One of the most overlooked aspects of the tax farm was its love of paperwork. Every transaction, toll, tariff, and arrest was documented, sometimes obsessively. An average tax bureau could produce hundreds of pages of documentation each month, detailing quantities of salt sold, revenue from tolls at a single bridge, arrests for tobacco possession, names and addresses of smugglers, confiscated barrels, carts, and mules. These documents piled up in archives, chests, and cabinets. They were not designed for transparency, but for internal accountability, ensuring that inspectors and sub-inspectors weren't stealing from their superiors. In some ways, this was a precursor to modern surveillance capitalism. Data collected not to help citizens, but to protect institutional profit. Historians today rely on these archives to reconstruct the everyday world of pre-revolutionary France. They show a kingdom suffocating under the weight of its own documentation, where life was recorded not in novels or journals, but in invoices and warrants. There is a certain bleak poetry to this. The kingdom that built Versailles, funded philosophers, and birthed ballet also recorded meticulously the number of cabbage heads taxed in Limoges. The signs of collapse. By the late 1780s, the situation had reached a breaking point. The crown's debt had ballooned. Bad harvests had caused food riots. Enlightenment thinkers called openly for the abolition of privilege. And still the tax farmers collected. In 1787, a secret report to the king revealed that tax farmers were enriching themselves at unprecedented levels, even as the government teetered on bankruptcy. The anger this generated was quiet at first, but soon turned into public rage. When the Estates General was called in 1789, one of the first demands from the Third Estate, the commoners, was the complete abolition of tax farming. By then, the firm Gainerail was no longer merely unpopular, it was a symbol of everything rotten in the ancient regime. As revolution approached, some tax farmers began quietly selling off assets, transferring wealth abroad, or fleeing Paris altogether. But it was too late. And so we are left to ask, could a revolution be triggered not by an uprising of arms, but by the silent turning of account books? When revolution finally came to France, it did not knock, it broke the door down. Years of structural injustice, unequal taxation, soaring bread prices, and government debt had pushed the nation to a boiling point. But among the most hated symbols of the old order were not just the nobles or the monarchs, but the ones who had quietly profited while pretending to serve. The fermiers Gainerails, the tax farmers. By 1793, many of the same men who had once dined in Versailles salons, who had owned country villas and adorned their hallways with Rococo portraits, were now sitting in prison cells, awaiting judgment from a tribunal with no patience for gilded paper trails. The revolution, like a tide turned red, was about to dismantle the most boringly powerful institution in France, one trial, one head at a time. This final section explores the fall of the firm Gainerail, the fate of the tax farmers themselves, and the long, dull shadow they left behind. The guillotine comes for the bookkeepers. As early as 1789, with the storming of the Bastille and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the days of tax farming were numbered. In August 1790, the National Assembly formally abolished the firm Gainerail. Tax collection was placed under the control of new state agents, with the intent to build a fairer, more rational fiscal system. But abolishing the institution wasn't enough. The revolution demanded justice, and justice demanded punishment. The fermiers' gaineyarchs became targets of public rage. They were not merely resented for their wealth, but for what that wealth represented: the monetization of suffering, the profit margins of starvation. Among the most notorious cases was that of Anton Lavoisier, a brilliant chemist and a member of the firm Gaineyrail. Known today as the father of modern chemistry, Lavoisier helped standardize chemical nomenclature, identified oxygen, and transformed science. But to the revolutionary government, he was a tax farmer first and a scientist second. In 1794, he was arrested and charged with conspiring against the Republic through his role in tax collection. Despite numerous pleas from the scientific community, Lavoisier was executed by guillotine on May 8, 1794. The judge is said to have quipped, "The Republic has no need of scientists or chemists." Alongside him, 28 other tax farmers were guillotined. Most had tried to flee, some had attempted to hide wealth, and a few believed their philanthropic efforts would spare them. They were wrong. For the revolution, there could be no half measures. The entire firm Gaineyrail, its offices, archives, uniforms, and institutional memory was purged. Account books were burned. Buildings were looted. Names were struck from registers. France wanted not just reform, but erasure. The post-farm fiscal chaos. Eliminating the firm Gaineyrail did not, however, create immediate fiscal clarity. The new government struggled to replace the revenue that the tax farms had once provided. The assignat currency collapsed in value. Inflation skyrocketed. Direct taxation proved difficult to enforce without the infrastructure the tax farmers had once maintained. Many of the lower-level clerks who had worked for the firm Gaineyrail quietly transitioned into roles in the revolutionary administration. They brought with them their skills, arithmetical, organizational, coldly precise. In this way, the institution died, but its methods survived. The bourgeois bureaucratic class, the keepers of ledgers and inspectors of salt, remained essential. The only thing that changed was who they served. The new state would eventually construct a more uniform taxation system under Napoleon, who understood, perhaps better than anyone, the need for revenue to support power. But he did so with the lessons, and sometimes the personnel of the old system. What they left behind. Today, the firm Gaineyrail is remembered primarily by specialists, economic historians, archivists, and Revolutionary-era researchers. Its name rarely appears in schoolbooks, but its influence is buried deep in France's administrative culture. Thousands of documents from tax farm survive in French archives. Reports of salt sales in Tours. Arrest records for tobacco smugglers in Marseille. Lease agreements from bridge tolls in Lyon. Expense ledgers for wine taxes in Bordeaux. They are tedious to read. There are no soaring speeches, no revolutionary slogans, but they offer something else, a slow-motion image of how power operates quietly over time with ink and law and silence. They show how a nation was bled not by grand battles but by daily deductions, made automatic through bureaucracy. They show how an empire's downfall can be bookkept. Boring tyranny. The firm Gaineyrail teaches a lesson that is easy to overlook in a world drawn to drama. Not all tyranny looks like a crown or a cannon. Sometimes it looks like a monopoly on salt, a toll at a bridge, or a surcharge on your morning tobacco. Sometimes oppression arrives with a receipt, printed in triplicate. And this kind of tyranny is durable. It hides in the mundane, in the acceptable, in the procedural. It grows slowly, feeding not on blood but on compliance. Even as revolutionary France burned its symbols, the structure of power rebuilt itself, less corrupt perhaps, but no less bureaucratic. Final reflection. In the end, the tax farmers were not overthrown because of what they collected, but because of what they revealed. A system so entrenched in inequality that it could no longer pretend to be reformable. Their ledgers were precise, their profits legal, their operations efficient. And yet, it was their very orderliness that made them monstrous. So we are left with one final, unsettling question. When justice finally comes, will it also bring its own bookkeepers? Story 4. The Postal Roads of Habsburg Europe. In the middle of the 16th century, a man in Vienna could send a letter to Brussels 1,000 kilometers away and expect it to arrive within 2 weeks. That might seem slow to modern eyes, but for the time, it was a marvel. It meant that news, decrees, accounts, and instructions could traverse a continent fractured by language, politics, and mountains, carried not by emissaries or knights, but by a system of paid couriers changing horses every 30 kilometers. This was the Reichspost, the imperial postal service of the Holy Roman Empire, later integrated into the broader Habsburg network. It was not glamorous. It moved at the pace of a tired horse. It relied on muddy roads, cold inns, and countless underpaid riders. But it did something that few institutions in early modern Europe could. It connected. And in the connections it forged between towns, merchants, princes, and spies, it shaped the slow, deliberate pulse of a continent not yet ruled by rail or wire, but by paper and saddle. The Taxis family, founders of a postal dynasty. The story of Habsburg postal roads begins, somewhat improbably, with a noble Italian family, the Tasso, later Thurn und Taxis. In the late 15th century, they were entrusted by Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, to organize a reliable courier service that would serve imperial interests across his patchwork realm. Maximilian understood that controlling an empire of fragmented territories, Germany, Austria, the Low Countries, parts of northern Italy, meant controlling communication. His armies needed orders. His tax collectors needed receipts. His suitors needed messages to and from foreign courts. The Taxis family offered a solution, a series of fixed postal routes, maintained with relays of fresh horses, designated inns, and postal agents at key stops. Riders would carry a leather satchel known as a posta from one station to the next, where a fresh rider and horse would take over. In this way, a message could travel far faster than any single courier could ride alone. By the early 1500s, the system stretched from Innsbruck to Brussels, from Prague to Milan. It was a revolution in logistics, built not for speed but for reliability. The Taxis family became postmasters general of the Holy Roman Empire, an inherited, contracted position that blended private entrepreneurship with imperial service. They profited handsomely, collecting tolls, fees, and privileges. They built mail depots, secured contracts, and ensured that the system remained operational even during wars, famines, and snowstorms. They were not bureaucrats. They were service providers, running one of Europe's first inter-regional communication infrastructures. The roads themselves, not quite Roman. Contrary to the romantic image of the ancient Roman roads still in use, most early modern postal roads were muddy, winding, and inconsistently maintained. Some were paved with cobblestones, others were little more than rutted dirt paths that became impassable in rain. The Postal Service did not build roads, it relied on existing infrastructure, supplementing it with way stations and postal inns every 20-30 kilometers. These inns had to maintain stables of fresh horses, often 4 or more, sleeping quarters for messengers or travelers, repair tools for carts and saddles, cooks and clerks to feed and document each delivery. The riders themselves, often called postilions, were poorly paid, physically fit, and sometimes illiterate. They were expected to ride in all weather, carry messages of all types, and keep to their schedules with near military precision. Each leg of a route had a scheduled time. Couriers were fined for lateness, unless the delay could be documented. Logs were kept meticulously when a horse left when it arrived, and whether the leather satchel was sealed. In bad weather, mail slowed to a crawl. In war, it was diverted. In plague years, entire routes were suspended. But the system adapted, detouring through safer provinces or posting quarantine notes along infected routes. It was a kind of slow-motion internet, prone to outages, but staggeringly advanced for its time. Who used the mail? At first, the imperial post was intended primarily for government and court use, a way for the emperor to communicate with his vassals, and for military orders to be transmitted quickly. But over time, private citizens were permitted to send letters through the system for a fee. The result was the birth of something unexpected, a proto-public postal network, available to merchants, lawyers, scholars, and even ordinary townspeople. Letters could be sent from Vienna to Augsburg or from Nuremberg to Antwerp, provided the sender paid postage and followed proper protocol. Sealed letter, correct address, payment in coins or voucher. Rates were determined by distance, weight, and urgency. Commercial correspondence flourished. Merchant houses used the system to coordinate shipments, credit, and pricing across cities. Jewish communities used it to send funds and family news. Universities used it to correspond with scholars across borders. By the 17th century, some cities even hosted post days, when the arrival of mail was a community event. Public notices were posted. News was shared. Foreign correspondence was read aloud in inns and salons. The system wasn't fast, but it was trusted, and that trust made it powerful. Censorship, spies, and information control. Of course, with communication came surveillance. The Habsburg state, like all early modern governments, was acutely aware of the dangers of uncontrolled information. Letters could contain heresy, sedition, or treason. So the postal system included a shadow function, interception. Certain post offices had secret compartments and secondary rooms where letters could be opened, read, copied, and resealed, especially those going to or from suspect individuals, foreign agents, or religious minorities. Known as black chambers, these rooms operated under imperial warrant, often with local magistrates' approval. Their existence was not public, but they were widely suspected. Some letters bear the signs of tampering: new wax seals, slightly opened folds. In wartime, mail routes became tools of espionage. Couriers might carry false letters to confuse the enemy. In some cases, postmasters were bribed to delay or divert mail. The slow pace of information could be weaponized. And yet, despite this dark undercurrent, the public generally accepted the system's imperfections. Delays were expected, intrusions were suspected, but delivery was almost always achieved. Imperial power at a trot. The Habsburg Empire was a marvel of complexity: dozens of territories, languages, legal systems, and cultures. It had no single capital for much of its early life. Vienna, Prague, Brussels, and Madrid all served as administrative centers at various times. To hold it together, even loosely, required not just military strength or dynastic marriage but reliable messaging. And in this, the postal roads played a crucial role. Edicts from the emperor could reach distant provinces in days, not months. Tax records could be centralized. Border violations could be reported. Marriage negotiations could be discreetly managed. It wasn't just a mail system. It was a nervous system, transmitting signals across the vast imperial body. And as the system expanded, the Thurn Untaxis family grew more powerful. They were granted princely titles, owned estates across Europe, and were regarded as essential infrastructure, not unlike how we view telecommunications companies today. But theirs was a power rooted in monotony: horses, ink, and parchment. And so we are left to wonder. In an empire of emperors and armies, was the most enduring force the one that carried letters instead of swords? By the early 17th century, The Habsburg postal roads were no longer simply lines on a map, they were veins of power, stretched taut across a vast, fragmented empire. These roads did not carry gold or soldiers, but messages, instructions, contracts, declarations, secrets, and gossip. Each sealed envelope, marked with wax and stamped with a signet, was a symbol of reach and legitimacy. This section follows the system's expansion and entanglement in the deeper social, political, and administrative life of early modern Central Europe. What began as a tool of imperial command had, by the mid-1600s, become a tool of social coherence, one that made possible not just governance, but business, belonging, and belief. And yet it remained boring. That was its strength. Expansion, standardization, and spoked cartwheels. During the 17th and early 18th centuries, the Thurn-und-Taxis family transformed their postal service from a Habsburg curiosity into a pan-European institution. The service now connected Vienna to Venice, Brussels to Barcelona, Prague to Paris. In total, more than 20,000 kilometers of routes were in operation by 1700, maintained by a network of over 1,500 postal stations, each tasked with caring for horses, riders, and mailbags in carefully timed relays. But expansion created complexity. To manage such a network, the Taxis family implemented early forms of standardization. Schedules, routes were timed to the hour. Some ran twice per week, others daily. Fees, postage rates were codified, based on distance and weight. Letters were measured using brass gauges or placed on scales to determine pricing. Seals, to avoid disputes and prevent tampering, letters had to be sealed with wax and a signature. A broken seal could void delivery. Postmasters in major cities began to issue printed bulletins showing arrival times and recent delays. These were posted outside inns, libraries, and markets, early versions of arrival boards. Cart technology also evolved. Covered wagons replaced horseback delivery on high-volume routes, allowing for the bulk transport of mailbags and freight. These wagons became a common sight, creaking along cobblestone roads, splashing through muddy lanes, laden not with luxury goods, but with paper and obligation. One could say the empire rolled forward not on war horses or royal carriages, but on wooden postal carts, each with iron-rimmed wheels and a driver who never knew the contents of his load. Information and administration. The empire becomes self-aware. While the postal roads began as a method of control, they slowly reshaped the very nature of governance. With reliable mail, it became possible for provincial governors to report more frequently. Court cases could be appealed to higher authorities. Local tax records could be audited from afar. And the imperial diet, the Reichstag, could send minutes, votes, and petitions between cities in semi-real time. This gave rise to what historians sometimes call the paper state, a government that existed as much in letters as in physical presence. The Habsburgs could now exert influence over distant territories not by marching troops, but by sending a strongly worded letter with the proper seal. A slow bureaucracy emerged, staffed by clerks, translators, record keepers, and seal inspectors. These men spent their careers reading letters, copying decrees, and filing decisions. Most never left the capital, yet their work shaped the fates of regions they would never see. Even language began to stabilize. German, Italian, and Latin were most common, but increasing standardization pushed for simplified formats, formulaic phrasing, and the use of official stamps. Letters often began and ended the same way, not because people lacked creativity, but because predictability ensured legibility across cultural lines. Thus, the post created a kind of imperial identity not forged in flags, but in templates and terminology. The social life of the post. Outside of state affairs, the post began to shape daily life for ordinary people, especially in urban centers. Merchants depended on regular correspondence for prices in distant markets. ship arrivals and cargo manifests, payment instructions and credit transfers. By 1700, merchant houses in cities like Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Trieste employed entire offices of correspondence clerks. These men spent their days writing polite letters, calculating postage, and binding past correspondence in thick volumes, a kind of analog database. Private citizens began to use the post more regularly as well. Love letters, petitions to the emperor, requests for positions, and family updates all flowed through the same system that carried political decrees. This created an interesting dynamic. The same infrastructure carried both the mundane and the monumental. Inns and way stations became hubs of information. People would gather on known mail days to hear news from distant cousins or reports from the imperial court. Newspapers, in their earliest form, often relied on these same postal routes to distribute copies from major printing centers to provincial towns. The people didn't just wait for news, they waited for proof of connection, proof that their world was not isolated. Even if it took weeks, a letter meant they mattered to someone far away. And this too is power. Letters as evidence, memory, and control. The Habsburg postal system generated more than movement, it generated archives. Every significant communication was recorded, duplicated, and often stored. Paper was relatively expensive, and so letters were reused, recopied, or stored tightly folded in bundles, sometimes stitched into ledgers. These archives became essential for proving property claims, reconstructing criminal investigations, tracing tax obligations, verifying inheritance. A single letter could determine whether a widow received her late husband's pension. Another might prove whether a merchant had paid his duties. Letters were evidence, and postmasters treated them with near-sacred care. In times of unrest, destroying a mailbag was considered an act of rebellion. In 1620, Bohemian rebels seized a postal depot and publicly burned imperial letters, sending a clear message. Communication was power, and they would sever it. Yet, paradoxically, the system was also used to maintain peace. In times of local conflict, messages sent via the postal roads could de-escalate tensions before violence erupted. A slow reply might prevent a duel. A carefully worded letter might avoid a mutiny. Thus, the roads did more than carry information. They carried intention, delays, detours, and the romance of reliability. It would be easy to romanticize the Habsburg post as flawless. It was. Routes were often closed by weather, snow in the Alps, floods in the Danube basin, war, especially during the 30 Years' War, banditry, particularly in sparsely patrolled forests. When delays occurred, the system responded not with innovation, but with paperwork. Missing mail required a formal inquiry. A letter's absence could trigger a month of correspondence between stations, as each attempted to prove it was not at fault. This bureaucracy frustrated some, but others appreciated it. It meant that everyone was accountable. Every station had to explain itself. Ironically, this glacial pace of correction increased public trust. The system was seen as dependable precisely because it never claimed to be fast. The invisible web. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Habsburg postal roads had become one of the most complex logistical systems in Europe. They weren't flashy. They didn't shape revolutions or crown emperors, but they underpinned nearly every act of governance, commerce, and diplomacy. The empire they connected was incoherent on the surface, diverse, disunified, and delicate. But below that chaos was a skeleton of paper, held together by wax, wheels, and the will to stay in touch. These roads did not command loyalty through fear. They inspired reliability through repetition. And so the question lingers quietly. Can you hold an empire together one envelope at a time? By the 18th century's end, The Habsburg postal system had become so embedded into daily life that few questioned its presence. Like the tolling of bells or the turning of seasons, it simply was, but nothing endures unchanged. The very strength of the system, its reliance on relay horses, inns, wax seals, and messengers would become its weakness. As the modern world began to stir with the rumble of industry, the postal roads found themselves increasingly outpaced, not only by new technologies, but by new expectations. This final section traces the decline of the imperial postal roads, the fate of the Thurn Untaxis dynasty, and the enduring legacy of a system built on slow, reliable movement. In doing so, we confront a deeper question. What happens to infrastructure when no one notices it anymore? The railway arrives, iron versus horse. The first true threat to the postal road system wasn't revolution, rebellion, or war, it was the railroad. When the first Austrian steam locomotives began operating in the 1830s, they could move both people and mail at unprecedented speeds. What had taken a courier 6 days could now be accomplished in 2. The cost per letter dropped, volume increased, and the public began to expect regularity, not just reliability. The imperial state, recognizing the importance of speed, began investing in railway infrastructure. But this created a dilemma. The Thurn Untaxis family still held private rights to much of the postal operation under centuries-old contracts. The family was not eager to relinquish control. They had built their fortune over generations, and although their riders were slower, their network was vast and their archives deep. Negotiations dragged on for decades. Some regions operated dual systems, rail post for major routes, horse post for rural ones. But duplication was inefficient. The centralizing tendencies of modern bureaucracies favored a unified state-run system. Finally, in 1867, the German postal system absorbed the Thurn Untaxis service. The Habsburg Empire followed suit shortly after. The family was compensated handsomely, but their power, the power to shape the flow of information, was gone. The era of the horse relay was over. What happened to the postmasters? The Thurn Untaxis family, stripped of their postal monopoly, pivoted. They retained vast land holdings, diversified into finance, and remained minor aristocracy into the 20th century. Their palaces, including the Baroque splendor of St. Emmeram in Regensburg, stand to this day. Many postmasters, however, those anonymous men who had served stations in Bohemia, Silesia, and the Tyrol, found themselves unemployed or folded into the new civil service. Some adapted, others did not. For many smaller towns, the postal inn was the town's social and commercial anchor. When it closed, life changed. Inns that once hosted riders and sorted letters became taverns or residences. Relay stables were converted into barns or storage sheds, and over time, the very memory of their function faded. In some cases, old road signs still bear faded names like Poststrasse or Kaiserliche Haltestelle, but few know why. The network had been so successful that it disappeared into normalcy. It was taken for granted until it was gone. The archives, letters that outlived empires. What remains most remarkable about the Habsburg postal roads is not their infrastructure, but their paper trail. Across Austria, Germany, the Czech Republic, and northern Italy, scholars have uncovered tens of thousands of surviving documents. Route maps drawn in ink on parchment. Fee tables showing the cost of sending a letter from Graz to Milan. Weather reports attached to delayed dispatches. Complaints from citizens about lost or open mail. Decades-long ledgers of relay horses fed and retired. These records are not dramatic, they are not beautiful, but they form a unique memory not of kings or conquests, but of logistical endurance. In the Austrian state archives, one can find bundles of letters tied with string, each still bearing the wax seal of an imperial department. Some are unopened, their contents no longer known. Others contain pages of cramped handwriting discussing grain shipments, water levels, or border taxes, the mundane business of empire. And then there are personal letters, between separated family members, between lovers, between merchants and partners long since buried. They survive because the system that delivered them was methodical enough to preserve itself, even unintentionally. Today, historians read these letters not just for what they say, but for what they prove. That communication in its dullest, most repetitive form is the foundation of statehood. Legacy in a post-postal world. The Habsburg postal roads may be gone, but their DNA lives on. In modern bureaucracies, in the European Union's freedom of movement rules, in the formality of administrative correspondence across Central Europe. More subtly, they survive in the expectation that governments will deliver messages, not just letters, but instructions, services, clarifications, benefits. The very idea that the state should connect its people owes something to this dusty network of horse relays and sealed envelopes. Even the notion of centralized data archives, standardized records available across regions, finds an ancestor in the Reichspost. But most people will never hear of it. The Thurn Untaxi's name appears in crossword puzzles and footnotes. Postal inns are turned into airbums. Routes are repaved into highways. The road becomes the background, and that is what infrastructure is meant to do, function so well it becomes invisible. Final reflection. In the end, the story of the Habsburg postal roads is not one of failure, but of quiet success. It was never meant to dazzle. It was meant to connect slowly, predictably, and with as few surprises as possible. It served princes and peasants, generals and lovers, bankers and bishops, and it did so without fanfare, because efficiency never makes headlines. And so we ask one final question, trudging through the mud of memory. Is it possible that the most revolutionary technology of early modern Europe was the reliable delivery of a letter? Story 5. Corn Riots in Devon, the Forgotten Bread Wars of England. In the rolling hills and hedgerows of Devon, far from the smoky tumult of London or the high politics of Westminster, a quieter and slower revolution brewed during the 18th century. It did not erupt with muskets or manifestos. It unfolded in market squares, around grain sacks, beside weighing scales, and under the watchful eyes of constables and merchants. These were the corn riots, localized uprisings by ordinary people in the towns and villages of southern England. They were not revolutionary in the French sense, nor nationally coordinated like the later labor movements. But they reflected something just as potent, a collective defense of moral economy, rooted in centuries of expectation that food, especially bread, should be accessible, affordable, and fairly distributed. What made the corn riots so interesting, so quietly radical, was how they emerged not from abstract ideology, but from deep local knowledge of prices, harvests, and supply chains. In this first section, we begin with the markets of Devon, where grain prices shifted like the wind, and where peasants, housewives, sailors, and apprentices began to lose their patience. What was corn? First, a clarification. In 18th century England, corn did not refer specifically to maize as it does in modern American English, but rather to grain in general, most commonly wheat, barley, and oats. Wheat was the grain of choice for bread, especially white bread, which was favored by the upper and middle classes. Barley and oats were more common among the rural poor, used for coarse loaves and porridge. The word corn thus meant life, especially for those who could afford little else. In a good year, Devon's fields produced ample grain for local consumption. In a bad year, especially if compounded by wet weather, failed harvests, or war, grain became scarce, and prices soared. What made matters worse was the emerging system of market liberalization. Merchants and millers were beginning to think of grain not as a local necessity, but as a commodity, one that could be moved, hoarded, or exported depending on price. To the working poor, this was not just inconvenient, it was a moral betrayal. The moral economy of the marketplace. In early modern England, the moral economy was an unwritten social contract. It held that certain essential goods, especially bread, should be sold at reasonable prices, and that community welfare trumped private profit. This belief was deeply ingrained, especially in rural areas where people lived within tight-knit communities. Villagers knew the grain yield, the number of sacks in the merchant's barn, and the average price of bread from the previous year. They understood supply and demand, but they also believed in fairness. Markets were public affairs. The assize of bread, a set of legal guidelines, regulated the weight and cost of loaves based on the price of grain. Bakers who broke the rules could be fined, shamed, or worse. Likewise, in grocers, those who bought up grain in bulk to resell at higher prices were often despised. As England moved toward a freer market economy, these customs began to break down. Export was allowed, even during shortages. Speculation increased. Grain was sometimes stored during times of need in hopes of higher prices later. For rural communities like those in Devon, this was not merely an economic shift. It was a moral insult. The spark, shortage, and suspicion. Throughout the 1740s and 1750s, a series of poor harvests, combined with wartime demand and exportation, created chronic shortages in the southwest of England. Devon was particularly hard hit due to its distance from London's centralized grain supplies and its dependence on maritime trade, which was easily disrupted by conflict or weather. In towns like Exeter, Tiverton, and Honiton, grain prices began to climb. Bakers reduced the size of loaves. Poorer families began to skip meals or substitute with cheaper grains. The public became deeply suspicious of local merchants and farmers. Rumors spread, some true, some not, that millers were diluting flour with chalk, that merchants were shipping grain to foreign ports, and that farmers were refusing to sell locally in order to raise prices. These suspicions were not without precedent. Records from the period show that grain was indeed being moved from local markets to higher-paying urban ones, especially Bristol and London. Some cargoes left from Devon's own ports. To many locals, this was not merely business, it was treason against the community. The crowd takes the scales. The first corn riots in Devon did not begin with banners or speeches. They began with interruptions. Women refused to allow merchants to remove grain from markets. Crowds gathered to reassess prices, sometimes forcing bakers and sellers to lower them on the spot. Grain carts were stopped on the roads. Their contents were examined. If prices seemed too high, the grain was either confiscated or sold at a just rate. These actions were not chaotic. They were organized, deliberate, and often nonviolent, at least initially. One chronicler described a scene where a crowd set the price of a bushel by voice vote and carried the matter forthwith. In many towns, the local authorities tolerated or even quietly approved of these actions. Mayors and magistrates knew that suppressing such protests with force could backfire. Instead, they often negotiated or pretended not to see. It was a kind of popular price control, imposed by the crowd when the official mechanisms failed. But things did not always remain peaceful. Violence at the granary. In Tiverton in 1756, when a merchant was caught moving large sacks of grain out of the town during a particularly lean spring, a crowd gathered. They surrounded his wagons, demanded the sacks be opened, and discovered them full of clean, white wheat. The merchant was accused of betraying the people. The grain was seized, and some of it was sold directly to the poor at a fraction of market rate. The rest was dumped onto the street. The merchant fled. His storehouse was looted. A few days later, rioters broke into a mill, claiming it was hoarding flour. The militia was summoned, but by the time they arrived, the crowd had dispersed. There were no arrests. Events like this were not everyday occurrences, but they were not rare, either. They reflected a kind of functional anarchy, where the state was too weak or too ambivalent to enforce its own economic rules. Women at the front. One of the most notable features of the corn riots in Devon was the prominent role of women. In many instances, it was women who began the protests, stood at the front of the crowd, and even negotiated with local officials. Why? Because in most working households, women were responsible for buying bread, preparing meals, and managing the weekly budget. They knew, often to the penny, what a loaf of bread should cost. When prices rose unjustifiably, it was their sense of betrayal that mobilized action. In some accounts, women carried wooden paddles, used for baking, as symbolic tools of justice. Others confronted merchants in the street, shamming them publicly. This was not revolutionary feminism. It was practical survival, and it challenged the assumption that politics belonged only to men. State response: reform or repression. By the late 1760s, the corn riots in Devon had become a recurring feature of economic life. They were not annual, but they were expected like a seasonal protest that arrived with shortages. The government took notice. Some responses were punitive: arrests, the calling of troops, the use of riot acts, but others were reformist. Authorities began to consider better grain storage regulation, local relief programs, restrictions on export during scarcity. But none of these measures addressed the core issue: that a society moving toward free markets was colliding with a population that still believed in communal obligation. And so the unrest continued, never fully suppressed, never fully victorious. So we must ask, when markets fail to feed the people, do the people have the right to reset the scales? As the corn riots continued into the late 18th century, they took on a more structured and, in some cases, more confrontational character. What had once been spontaneous interruptions of grain wagons and impromptu market protests began to develop the patterns of a mature local resistance movement, grounded in ritual, repetition, and public memory. This section examines how the corn riots evolved from reactive outbursts into a kind of seasonal negotiation, a process through which ordinary people, especially women and laborers, sought to enforce fairness in the face of growing economic liberalization. It also explores the increasing tension between these communities and the state, particularly as militias were introduced, laws stiffened, and ideas about who controlled the price of food began to shift permanently. Price watching as public duty. In modern times, inflation is tracked by economists and news outlets. But in the market towns of Devon, everyone was an economist because survival depended on it. Housewives tracked the weekly price of a quartern loaf. Farmers compared the cost of seed grain to the expected return. Bakers calculated profit margins with ruthless precision, adjusting the weight of loaves and shifting ingredients as necessary. But when prices rose too quickly, or too far beyond the known average, the community noticed. What followed was often a collective response that blurred the line between protest and economic regulation. In some towns, price watchers emerged in formal groups, often led by women, who monitored merchants and bakers for signs of profiteering. They could be seen in markets measuring flour with small scales, asking pointed questions about grain origins, or even inspecting storage barrels. If unfair pricing was found, the punishment wasn't legal, it was performative. Crowds would chant or sing parodies of well-known ballads, mocking the merchant. Demand a just price be declared publicly. Force the seller to drop prices on the spot, or redistribute flour and bread. These actions rarely involved property destruction at first. Instead, they functioned as communal correction mechanisms. A baker might be humiliated but not harmed. A merchant might lose a day's profits but keep his stall. It was, in many ways, an expression of popular sovereignty, a community asserting that food justice outweighed legal contract. When the Redcoats came to town, by the 1770s, the state began to take a more aggressive stance. While local magistrates had often tolerated these disruptions either out of sympathy or fear, the national government viewed them as a threat to market order and property rights. In the wake of particularly large or coordinated actions, militia units were summoned. These were not standing armies but locally raised soldiers, often led by gentry or retired officers. They arrived with drums, muskets, and sometimes mounted patrols. Their presence changed the tone immediately. What had been scenes of barter and shouted protest became fields of tension and intimidation. In 1772, during a particularly poor harvest, a large protest in Exeter led to a standoff between several hundred townspeople and a militia detachment. The crowd had stopped 2 grain wagons headed for shipment out of the county and demanded the sacks be opened. The militia, acting under orders, attempted to disperse the crowd. Stones were thrown. Muskets were fired. 2 protesters were killed. In the inquest that followed, no soldiers were punished. The coroner ruled it a justified use of force to protect lawful commerce. But among the townspeople, the message was clear. The law was not on their side. Such incidents hardened attitudes. In some cases, protests grew more strategic, planned for days when militias were known to be elsewhere, or timed with the arrival of new grain shipments. The riot became a tactic, not just a reaction. Bakers, boundaries, and bread frauds. The corn riots weren't just about raw grain, they were also about the final product, bread. Under English law, bakers were subject to the assize of bread, a medieval regulation that tied the weight of a loaf to the market price of wheat. As prices rose, loaves could shrink. But if bakers cut corners by underweighting loaves or mixing flour with chalk, bone meal, or rye, they faced public outrage. Inspectors were supposed to enforce the assize, but corruption and neglect were common, so the public took on the role themselves. In Honiton, a baker accused of selling underweight bread was paraded through the town with a fake loaf hung around his neck. In Barnstaple, townspeople entered a bakery suspected of fraud, measured the loaves against an official assize chart, and burned the flour sacks they deemed adulterated. In Tiverton, a popular crowd chant emerged. No chalk, no ash, no hungry bellies, give us loaves for honest pennies. These rituals weren't lawless, they were restorative, aiming to shame bakers back into compliance. Notably, while some bakeries were damaged, full-scale destruction was rare. The goal wasn't to eliminate the bakers. It was to discipline them to ensure they understood their role in the moral economy of sustenance. Women and the logic of the loaf. Throughout this period, women remained the backbone of protest. They were not passive observers, they were planners, spokespersons, and frontline actors. Historians have recovered dozens of petitions, many written by women or signed by predominantly female groups, asking magistrates to regulate grain hoarding, suspend export licenses, cap bread prices during shortages. One petition from 1783, written in shaky but legible script by a group of widows in rural Devon, included the line, "We do not riot to undo the kingdom, but to save our children from starving breadless." This framing was powerful. It portrayed riot not as rebellion, but as maternal duty. In some towns, women created temporary unions, networks of buyers who pooled funds to purchase grain cooperatively and distribute it fairly. Though not sustained over years, these efforts showed a deep understanding of economic leverage, long before formal labor movements. These women were not revolutionaries in the political sense. They were guardians of social equilibrium, defending the price of bread as though it were a matter of life and law, because to them, it was. Lawmakers and laissez-faire. By the late 1780s, Britain's Parliament, influenced by Enlightenment economics, began to side more aggressively with free trade ideology. Thinkers like Adam Smith had argued that market prices, not social tradition, should determine the flow of goods. The Corn Laws, enacted in 1773 and modified over time, deregulated much of the domestic grain trade. Exports were encouraged in some conditions. Price supports were removed. The market was now sovereign. But the people of Devon and many other parts of rural England did not surrender their older beliefs easily. The corn riots continued, even as the law shifted further away from them. This created a growing dissonance. The official system said grain was a commodity, but the people still believed it was a public trust. That contradiction would not be resolved for another generation, and only after widespread starvation, protest, and eventually, mass political reform in the 19th century. The ritualization of protest. By the turn of the 19th century, corn riots in Devon had become almost ritualized. Grain arrivals were tracked in public. Price shifts were posted in town squares. Expected crowd behavior chanting, petitioning, stalling wagons was understood. Authorities often waited to act, gauging how far the protest would go. It was no longer simple revolt. It was a seasonal negotiation, part of the cycle of survival in a rural economy that refused to forget its obligations, even as the nation around it moved on. And so we must ask again, and more urgently, when the law abandons fairness, is fairness itself still illegal? As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the corn riots, once a regular fixture of English rural life, began to fade. Not because the grievances were resolved, or because bread became universally affordable, but because the structures of protest were quietly dismantled, replaced by centralized governance, new ideologies, and changing technologies. This final section explores how the corn riots declined not through revolution or resolution, but through the erosion of collective power. We trace the disappearance of community-driven price justice, the rise of national policy over local tradition, and the long, quiet transformation of bread from a communal right into a private purchase. Industrialization and the dispersal of protest. By the early 1800s, Devon and much of rural England began to feel the influence of industrialization. While Devon never became a major industrial hub, the spread of roads, railways, and population shifts slowly weakened the tight bonds that had once sustained local protest. Three key changes contributed to the decline of the corn riots. Urbanization. Younger generations began leaving rural villages for factory towns, seeking more stable wages. This drained the countryside of the dense communal networks that once supported rapid mobilization. Changing markets. Improved transport allowed grain to move more quickly across regions. Prices, while still volatile, became more nationalized, less prone to sharp local manipulation, and harder for one town to influence. Stronger policing. After the Napoleonic Wars, the British state invested heavily in law enforcement infrastructure. The Riot Act was applied more swiftly. Troops were deployed preemptively. Public order became a top concern, especially after events like the Peterloo Massacre, 1819, which confirmed the state's willingness to suppress crowd action by force. As a result, corn riots became less frequent, and when they did occur, they were often short-lived and harshly repressed. Bread becomes a private matter. With the decline of collective enforcement of the moral economy, the concept of bread as a shared public concern began to vanish. No longer were bakers shamed in the streets. No longer did women block grain wagons. Instead, bread became something you either could afford or could not. The poor laws provided minimal support, but the idea that the community could directly control food prices disappeared. This shift reflected a broader transformation in British society. The rise of individualism, market capitalism and liberal economic theory placed faith in competition, not custom, to regulate prices. The Corn Laws, infamous for protecting British grain producers from cheaper imports, would remain in force until 1846. But by that time, the Corn Riots were already history, remembered dimly in local lore or scrawled in magistrates' ledgers. The moral economy had been replaced by the market economy. What remains in the records? The Corn Riots may not have left monuments, but they did leave a paper trail. In the county archives of Devon, one finds list of seized grain sacks, petitions to magistrates protesting bread prices, transcripts from riot trials, expense records for militia deployment, eyewitness accounts of housewives laying siege to the bakeries. These documents are dry, measured, bureaucratic. They rarely express the emotion behind the events, but together they show a population deeply engaged in defending the terms of its own survival. Some records even show moments of sympathy from local officials. In 1795, a magistrate in Exeter noted, "The women do not wish to upend the realm. They simply want bread at a price that does not take the whole day's labor." Such sentiments grew rarer with time, a legacy lost to memory. Today, few people outside of academic circles remember the Corn Riots. They are not taught in most school curricula. There are no statues of the women who stopped grain carts or forced bakers to answer to the crowd. No national memorial marks the towns where bread justice was shouted from market stalls. But their legacy lingers in subtle ways. In modern debates over food deserts and price gouging, in movements for fair trade, food banks, and universal school meals, in the question of whether food is a right or merely a commodity. What the Corn Riots remind us is that economics is never just numbers. It is power, morality, and survival, measured loaf by loaf. Final reflection. The Corn Riots were not heroic in the traditional sense. There were no banners of revolution, no manifestos, no grand speeches. Just women with wooden paddles, men watching grain scales, and towns full of people who believed that justice could be measured in ounces of flour. They lost in the end. Or perhaps more accurately, they were forgotten, washed away by modernity, their methods labeled quaint, their demands reduced to economic footnotes. But the question they asked has never disappeared. If a loaf of bread costs more than a day's work, what does that say about the fairness of a society? And perhaps more hauntingly, if we stop asking that question, what else might we lose? Story 6. The Dike Builders of the Dutch Golden Age. Beneath the shimmering oil paintings of Rembrandt and the merchant ships of the Dutch Golden Age lies a story less celebrated but arguably more essential. The quiet, constant, and collectively organized battle against the sea. This is the story of the dike builders, the planners, laborers, and landowners who transformed large swaths of the Netherlands from marsh and floodplain into farmland, villages, and trade hubs. These were not warriors or inventors. They were bureaucrats, bricklayers, and canal diggers, often unnamed and certainly uncelebrated. Yet without them, the Dutch Republic might never have existed. In this first section, we explore the origins of land reclamation, the early social and legal structures that governed dike building, and the technological monotony of digging ditches, piling earth, and plugging leaks century after century, meter by meter. This is not the history of how the Dutch fought the sea and won. This is the history of how they fought the sea and kept fighting, because the water never stops. The land that wasn't meant to be. Much of what is now the Netherlands sits below sea level. In the 12th century, large areas were tidal marshes, peat bogs, and flood-prone deltas, shaped by the Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt rivers as they emptied into the North Sea. Life here was difficult. Settlements were often built on man-made mounds called turpen or weirden to stay above floodwaters. Cattle farming was limited. Grain production was minimal. Saltwater intrusion ruined many crops. Every heavy storm risked washing away homes and fields. But by the 13th century, a new mindset emerged, the idea that the land could be shaped by collective action, not simply endured but engineered. Enter the dike. How to build a medieval dike slowly. Early dikes were rudimentary earthen embankments, usually constructed from locally available materials. Clay from riverbanks or marshland, peat cut from nearby bogs, reeds and brushwood for reinforcement, wooden stakes to prevent erosion from tides. Construction was labor-intensive. Without advanced machinery, everything was done by hand. Workers dug trenches, hauled soil in baskets or wheelbarrows, and tamped it down using simple tools. A typical dike was only a few meters wide and perhaps 2 to 4 meters tall. But its effectiveness wasn't in height, it was in regular maintenance. Because these structures weren't permanent, they were always failing, sagging, eroding, springing leaks. They required constant vigilance, especially after storms or seasonal high tides. To live near a dike was to accept that your labor never really ended. The polder system, shared risk, shared responsibility. The dike wasn't just a structure, it was a governance model. As early as the 12th century, local communities began forming polder boards, precursors to today's Dutch waterschappen, water boards. These were democratic in structure, made up of local landowners who met to decide how much each property should contribute in labor or taxes, who would inspect and repair which section of the dike, when new drainage canals should be dug, what penalties should be imposed for neglect. Failure to maintain your section of dike could result in fines or, in some regions, exile. This system worked not because it was just, but because it was necessary. If one person's section failed, everyone flooded. Dikes enforced a kind of collective accountability that many modern societies still struggle to replicate. There was no room for selfishness. The sea punished everyone equally. Dull but crucial, the water laws. By the 1300s, a vast body of legal precedent had emerged around dikes and polders. Some examples from regional statutes include a requirement that all cows be kept inland during maintenance season to avoid trampling the dike walls, rules about digging clay only from the non-sea facing side of a dike, a rotating calendar of inspection days, sometimes tied to religious holidays, strict guidelines for ditch depth, canal width, and sluice gate operation. These rules were recorded in thick ledgers, often written in Middle Dutch, with precise diagrams and annotations. They were boring and utterly indispensable. One surviving account from a polder near Dordrecht records the inspection of a 14-kilometer stretch of dike over the course of 3 weeks. Every crack, indentation, and misaligned reed mat was noted and assigned for repair. This was bureaucracy as survival. Who did the work? The actual labor of dike building and maintenance fell to a mix of groups. Local peasants, required by law or custom to contribute labor in exchange for protection from floods. Hired seasonal workers, especially during large expansion projects. Monks, particularly from the Cistercian order, who often ran water management operations from monastic estates. Engineers, who by the 16th century had become specialized in drainage and land reclamation. Work was slow, repetitive, and rarely acknowledged. One might spend a week digging a ditch, only to watch it collapse in the next storm. Dikes had to be monitored during heavy rains, with workers sent out in the dark to check for leaks or breaches. Winter posed special problems. Frozen sluices meant trapped water. Snowmelt risked overtopping the walls. Spring floods were anticipated with a mix of dread and preparation. To be a dike worker was to live with constant low-level anxiety. The beginning of expansion. By the late 15th century, the Dutch began to realize that dikes didn't just protect land, they could create it. Enter the poldering system. By building a ring of dikes around a body of water such as a shallow lake or marsh, and then draining it with canals and windmills, entirely new tracts of land could be made usable. This marked the start of intentional land creation. Towns like Leiden, Haarlem, and Alkmaar saw dramatic growth in nearby farmland, fueling the Dutch Republic's rise in the 17th century. But the new land had to be maintained perpetually. If the pumps failed or the dikes cracked, the land would revert to water in days. And so the balance shifted. The Dutch were no longer simply surviving floods. They were gambling, investing in a fragile expansion that depended on constant upkeep. Ending with a question. By the dawn of the Dutch Golden Age, hundreds of miles of dikes surrounded millions of reclaimed acres. Windmills spun, canals diverted rivers, market towns grew fat on trade and tulips. But underneath the prosperity was a question that haunted every water board, every ditch digger, and every farmer with soggy boots. If we stop digging, do we lose everything? The Dutch had not conquered the sea. They had made a deal with it, one that required endless maintenance and collective memory. As the 17th century began, the Netherlands stood at the center of a remarkable paradox. It was one of the richest, most urbanized societies in Europe, and much of it sat several feet below sea level. The Dutch Golden Age is often told through merchant fleets, Spinoza's philosophy, or Vermeer's canvases. But behind these flourishes lay something far more unromantic: a robust, regulated, and mind-numbingly persistent system of water management, quietly maintained by countless hands. This section examines how dike building, polder maintenance, and hydraulic infrastructure matured into a national obsession, administered by local water boards, powered by wind, and enforced by laws that made neglect illegal and shared labor mandatory. This is the age of canals, sluice gates, pumping stations, and the slow bureaucratic dance of keeping land where water wanted to be. The arrival of the windmill. One of the most iconic symbols of the Netherlands is the windmill, but its historical significance is not as a quaint landscape feature. It was a critical technological advancement in the war against water. The introduction of the horizontal axis windmill in the late 16th century revolutionized polder drainage. Unlike older scoop wheel methods that relied on manual or animal labor, windmills could operate continuously with minimal human input. Windmills were typically used to power Archimedean screws or scoop wheels, lifting water from polder canals into higher drainage channels, eventually emptying into nearby rivers or the sea. Key features. Each mill could pump several liters of water per second. Mills were often chained together in series, creating a stair-step system to lift water across elevation changes. Millers had to adjust the sails, monitor wind speed, and ensure the gearing didn't fail, especially during storms. This created a new class of laborer, the mill keeper, a job that was half engineering and half weather forecasting. Millers lived in isolated houses, watched the skis obsessively, and were blamed immediately if fields flooded. As one water board minute from 1651 records, the miller at Sloten did not keep the sails angled. His neglect has caused the east fields to flood, and he shall be fined 6 guilders and a half barrel of rye. The dike might be communal, but the windmill was personal responsibility. The waterschappen, democracy by ditch. While the Dutch Republic experimented with various forms of political representation, one of its most enduring and practical forms of governance was the water board, waterschap, or Hoogheemraadschap. These were hyperlocal administrative bodies, often predating towns and even provinces. Their sole task was to manage dike construction and repair, canal digging and dredging, sluice gate operation, flood response, dispute arbitration over drainage rights. Water boards met in low, unadorned halls, where they read complaints, examined levy reports, and imposed fines. Decisions were made by vote, typically weighted according to land ownership, a system that, while oligarchic, incentivized protection of the most at-risk properties. They issued documents like Current rules and ordinances governing waterworks, Skouboken inspection reports on dikes and ditches, Vermandingen formal warnings to negligent landowners. To be summoned by the board was no small matter. Failing to maintain a ditch or embankment could result in fines, seizure of land, or even public shamming your name scratched into ledgers as a danger to the community. The system worked because everyone depended on it. A single broken ditch could flood dozens of fields. A neglected culvert could rot an entire village's food supply. Dike psychology, fear as infrastructure. More than policy or technology, the success of Dutch water management relied on a less tangible factor: fear. This was not panic but a quiet, generational anxiety passed down in family stories and village lore. Children grew up hearing tales of the last flood, the night the water breached, the oxen that drowned in their stalls, or the neighbor who failed to warn others in time. The St. Elizabeth's flood of 1421, which had killed thousands and permanently reshaped the river delta, remained a touchstone for centuries. Every major flood was remembered not just as a natural disaster, but as a moral warning, a failure of diligence, duty, or collective will. This fear was institutionalized through rituals. Annual inspections, Skouwen, where entire communities turned out to walk the dikes and inspect them, often followed by public feasts. Dike oaths, in which members swore to uphold maintenance duties, even if the fields are dry for 10 years. School lessons on local water history, floods, and proper dike behavior. The result was a kind of civil religion of the dike, where even the smallest act, removing weeds from a canal, reporting a soft patch of ground, was invested with communal meaning. Maintenance as a moral act. By the middle of the 17th century, dike maintenance had become a moral obligation, as much as a technical one. The law might fine you, but your neighbors would judge you even more harshly. Some towns maintained wall tablets or wooden boards that listed recent violators, people who hadn't cleared drainage ditches, who delayed repairs, or whose windmills hadn't turned during storms. And yet the punishment was rarely corporal. The water boards relied instead on persistent social pressure and the shared belief that neglect was betrayal. Labor was required seasonally. In spring, dredging canals, clearing winter debris. In late summer, fortifying dikes before fall storms. After major rains, patrolling for seepage and boils, underground leaks where water bubbled up inland. It was repetitive, exhausting work, often thankless and never finished. When the system failed, despite all precautions, floods still came. In 1675, after a storm surge pushed seawater up the Zuiderzee, dozens of polders were breached in a matter of hours. In the town of Edam, emergency repairs failed when a dike gave way beneath the pressure of a rotting sluice gate. Testimony from the repair crew reads, "We heard it moan like timber giving birth, and then the bank melted into black water. Hundreds of acres were lost. Salt poisoned the soil. It took 9 years to reclaim the land, and in some areas never fully." Such disasters were traumatic not just for the economic cost, but for the emotional blow they dealt to a society that prided itself on vigilance. The system had failed, and that meant someone had failed. But rather than abandon the project, the response was usually more laws, tighter inspections, and renewed investment. Water management in the Netherlands wasn't perfect. It was just relentlessly improved. Construction expansion at a price. Flush with wealth from trade and colonial ventures, the Dutch in the 17th century expanded their waterworks aggressively. New polders were drained, including the massive Beemster polder, completed in 1612. a geometric marvel still visible today. Dual-purpose canals were dug to serve both agriculture and shipping, further complicating maintenance. New windmill designs allowed deeper drainage and higher capacity, but increased reliance on millers' expertise. Yet with each success came higher complexity. The system was now interlinked. A mistake in one town's sluice gate could flood another's polder. Water boards began holding joint meetings, coordinating across regions. The simple ditch had become a hydraulic network, and the dike builder was now a technician, citizen, and custodian of an invisible system few outsiders understood. Ending with a question. By the end of the Dutch Golden Age, the Netherlands had reclaimed thousands of square kilometers from the sea. Windmills dotted the horizon. The water boards met like clockwork. The dikes held. But as the 18th century approached and new pressures mounted war, economic decline, rising sea levels, another question began to creep into the margins of inspection books and board meetings. How long can vigilance survive prosperity? The Dutch had proven they could survive in a land shaped by water, but could they maintain their discipline when the urgency faded? By the 18th century, the great expansion of Dutch diking and land reclamation had slowed. The windmills still turned. The sluice gates still groaned open and shut. The water boards still met on time in low halls by candlelight. But something had changed. The flood had receded not only from the land, but also from the national imagination. In this final section, we trace the waning discipline of dike maintenance, the impact of war and neglect, and the slow reawakening in the face of catastrophic floods in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is a story of forgetting and remembering, of prosperity dulling vigilance, and of how an ancient communal task nearly faded only to return with devastating urgency. A system grows tired. By the late 1700s, the Netherlands had become a very different place. Trade was shifting away from the Dutch East India Company. Political unrest was growing, and many of the polders and dikes built a century earlier were now old, sagging, and poorly funded. Several interlinked problems emerged. Maintenance fatigue. Generations raised in relative calm had never known a major flood. Many neglected minor repairs or tried to avoid paying their polder taxes. Water board corruption. In some regions, the once democratic boards had become closed oligarchies, with positions held by elite landowners uninterested in routine maintenance. Technological stagnation. Windmills and sluice gates were still being used without major innovation, even as other countries advanced in steam power and hydrodynamics. The result was a slow but steady erosion of vigilance. One water board record from 1789 laments. The dikes are watched but not walked. The books are read but not corrected. The water rises and we debate what to charge for repairs we never make. The floods return. In 1809, a powerful storm combined with high tides to breach several dikes near the Biesbosch wetlands. The floodwaters swept inland, drowning hundreds of cattle and washing away barns and windmills. Entire villages were flooded. Crops failed for multiple seasons. More troubling was how long it took to respond. Local water boards disagreed over who was responsible. Emergency repairs were delayed by jurisdictional confusion. Over the next several decades, more floods followed. 1825, a storm surge devastated the northern coast. Over 300 people died. 1855, heavy rainfall overwhelmed central polders, including areas around Utrecht. 1926, another catastrophic breach forced the evacuation of thousands in the eastern provinces. Each disaster prompted temporary investment. Engineers were hired, dikes were patched, but then attention drifted again. It wasn't until 1953, with the North Sea flood, that the Netherlands was shaken back into full awareness. 1953, the day the sea returned. On the night of January 31st, 1953, a storm system over the North Sea coincided with a high spring tide. Water levels rose over 2 meters above normal. Dikes failed in over 90 locations, mainly in Zeeland and South Holland. The results were catastrophic. Over 1,800 people killed, 47,000 homes damaged or destroyed, over 150,000 acres of farmland flooded. Entire villages vanished beneath water and mud. The dikes had been too low, too old, too weak, and worst of all, many warnings had gone unheeded. The memory of ancient floods, once etched in community rituals, had faded. The event shocked the country. For the first time in centuries, the Dutch confronted the terrifying reality that their systems had grown complacent. The Delta Works and the technocratic age. The 1953 disaster triggered the creation of one of the largest civil engineering projects in human history, the Delta Works. Rather than simply patch existing dikes, the Dutch government embarked on a 40-year program to shorten the coastline by damming estuaries, reinforce and heighten all major dikes, install storm surge barriers, including the famous Oosterscheldekering, a movable dam that can seal off the sea during storms. The Delta Works restored faith in Dutch hydraulic engineering, but it also marked a shift in tone, from communal duty to technocratic centralization. No longer were villages walking dikes together. Now, engineers, state agencies, and automated systems managed the water. The water boards remained, but they became more specialized, professionalized, and regionalized. The civic rituals faded. Lessons from the quiet custodians. And so we return to the dike builders, not the engineers of modern megaprojects, but the anonymous laborers, millers, and ditch diggers of the Golden Age. What they built wasn't just land. It was a system of shared vigilance, enforced through boredom, ritual, and a deep cultural memory of disaster. That memory almost disappeared, and when it did, the floods came back. Today, as climate change brings rising seas and unpredictable storms, the Dutch once again face a choice. Will they invest not just in new barriers, but in a culture that remembers? Will they revive the ethic of maintenance? Or will the sea return, as it always threatens to? Final reflection. The dikes were never finished. That was the point. To build a dike was to join an unending cycle, one where your work mattered only if others also worked, where your success was measured in what didn't happen, and where vigilance had to be maintained even in times of calm. In a world that rewards novelty and speed, the story of the Dutch dike builders is almost alien. Their achievement wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, procedural, and invisible when it worked well. But their lesson remains. Some of the most important things in life are held together by people willing to be bored together forever.